Welcome to the second podcast from the team here at Quad. I'm Adam. Welcome back to the show.
And I'm Rebekah. Welcome back. Yeah.
And today we are joined by Mr. Darrell Buxton to bring his expertise in the knowledge of film, particularly about Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Yeah, very nice to be here.
Fantastic. So on the way over here this morning, before we started recording, I was thinking, well, it's the second podcast. I need to do some sort of like, welcome to Cine-Lit 2, Electric Boogaloo. But I didn't want to do Electric Boogaloo because everybody does Electric Boogaloo. So I thought, okay, we could do Cine-Lit 2, Cine Harder as a Die Hard reference. But then I thought, no, we're covering more than just mainstream Hollywood stuff. We're covering art house films and titles and things like that. So I wanted to bring in an art house example, and for the life of me I couldn't think of an art house sequel. Can you guys think of an art house sequel that has that kind of art house 2 more art house kind of title?
No, I don't think I can.
Yeah, I came up earlier with the only one I could think of was that we were talking about 2-part art movies, and I went back to the 20s and Fritz Lang's Dr. Mabuse films, The Gambler, the first one, and then Inferno. But
yeah,
that doesn't quite, work. So
in the sense that the sequel doesn't necessarily mean that it's a sequel. Like,
no,
it's not like it's the Seventh Seal 2 Seal Cup or something like that. Can't see.
We're talking about Jodorowsky today, and he's been planning for years and years and years, and I think now he's 90. He still wants to make it, I think, Son of El Topo, which is a sequel to one of his best-known films. So yeah, maybe if only he'd made that, we could have at least gone with Son of Quadcast or something like that,
Son of Quadcast, the curse of Cine-Lit.
Yeah.
Be quite
but
nice.
Electric Boogaloo is the benchmark for these things, so I think. So.
Yeah. I wonder how many people know that name who have never seen the film. Probably quite a lot, I think, because I don't think it was a massive hit, was it? But let's move on to other massive hits, actually, in the world of art house. Let's move on to Alejandro Jodorowsky, one of the major names in art house cinema, coming from the 60s, experimental period, and then making a handful of movies in the late 60s and early 70s that have probably stood the test of time just because of how out there they are. There's no one making films like him then, and there's probably no one making films like him now. So, let's begin with probably his famous. You mentioned it earlier, El Topo. One of the early key standout films in the acid western genre, which is having a bit of a renaissance at the moment with certain filmmakers. And westerns are always on people's radars. But I want to make a western. My favorite, Tarantino's just made his 2 westerns. Two westerns? Yeah, you did 2 westerns, yeah.
2.5, arguably. There's with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Sure, yeah, with his Outlaw Bounty? Bounty's Law.
Bounty Law,
that's it. Yeah. With his TV show. So westerns, filmmakers always seem to want to make a western, even though the genre has probably been dead for 30 plus years. It's always been on the highlights. And certain filmmakers, when they say they want to make a western, they're thinking about Alejandro Jodorowsky. So El Topo, Darrell, what do you reckon about El Topo? What impact did that film have on cinema?
Yeah, a big one, I think, because it fits right into that acid western sort of thing, which had been going on for a few years in Hollywood and beyond, sort of on the fringes of Hollywood, really, since about the mid-'60s with Monty Hellman's films. And then the big one, of course, was Easy Rider, which put its cowboys on bikes, and but still had them riding through all those great sort of western-type desert locations. And then El Topo comes along the following year and really hit big with the heads and the sort of counterculture, who I think were sort of, after seeing Easy Rider, everyone was looking for, or a certain part of the youth market was looking for what's going to be the next Easy Rider, and El Topo, I think, came along at just the right time. I don't think it's a film that was necessarily influenced by anything other than Jodorowsky wanting to make it, although, again, he'd have clearly been aware of what was going on in the American counterculture. And, of course, the other big thing is the so-called spaghetti western craze of the 60s and into the early 70s, which again filters into El Topo. So I think if you'd seen Easy Rider and if you'd seen The Good, the Bad and the Ugly in the year or two previously, El Topo is sort of those two films combined with a bit of Jodorowsky magic sort of thrown in as well.
So Becky, you you witnessed these films for the first time this weekend. Let's have your take. Do you want to try and boil down El Topo into like a paragraph to explain what the film's about?
Basically, I watched the first 5 minutes last night, and I was just like, "What the?" And then it took a while to get going, and I was just like, I was talking to myself, I was like, this just doesn't make any sense. Like, I was like, no, I feel like I need to be on something to understand this film. But then after a while, I started to sort of get into it, and towards the end, I was intrigued, which I thought meant that I probably enjoyed it. Because if I disliked the film, I'd have been like, oh gosh, no. I think I got like the biblical references and things like that. So I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I do think I can appreciate it, if that's really what I can say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I wasn't around at the time when the films came out, so I didn't watch them then. But when I came back to them in like the 90s and they were reissued, I've been a big fan of David Lynch at that point, and I got onto that stage in my readings of David Lynch that I stopped trying to impose meaning on watching the films and just went along for the ride. And I find now every time I watch a Lynch movie or his Twin Peaks things, not putting meaning on it and just watching it and going along for the ride, I get so much more out of it. And so when I came to Jodorowsky, I was fully prepared just to not understand everything and just be swept along with it. So yes, I think probably I had a different first viewing from other people did. It is interesting. Is it the film that you need to be on something because they were on something while they were making it, and it became famous because of that?
I think films like El Topo and like Easy Rider and like a lot of that counterculture stuff from around that era, sort of 67 to 73, almost works as drugs. You don't necessarily need to be on something other than the celluloid. I think while you're watching the movies, they sort of work in the way that LSD or something would as well.
They were trying to recreate the trip sort of thing, a la,
and the best of the films, and a lot of them do manage that. You watch something like Vanishing Point or Two Lane Blacktop, for instance. Both of which you could almost say are on the fringes of the acid western. Again, with motor vehicles going through those amazing sort of desert settings, and with the characters having a sort of 1970s viewpoint that's not dissimilar to what you'd see in a cowboy movie.
Yeah, that's sort of like what's the one called? Like a depression, sort of like the world's about to end. There's no point in anything. What's the word I'm looking for?
Sort of apocalyptic
annihilism sort of thing. Yeah.
And this occasionally transmits to the film, the visuals themselves, like the end of Two Lane Blacktop, which is another Monty Hellman movie where the film actually jams at the end and the frame burns up, and we never actually see what the ending is. And if that's not movie drugs, I don't know what is. So yeah, I'd say that you don't necessarily need to be on something to appreciate these films, because that's sort of infused into the films anyway.
Yeah, and I agree with Adam in the sense that you're there for the ride, to the point when I was watching it, it was like I was excited to see what will happen next, because anything could be in the next scene. It's sort of like an experience, like a drug.
Yeah, I've been watching the reissued Monty Python episodes recently, and it's been weird watching Jodorowsky films and then watching a couple of episodes of Monty Python and so on, because they almost follow the same structure. They're Jodorowsky's films are often, like you say, Rebecca, they're very sketchy from scene to scene to scene. It could connect with something you saw 5 minutes ago, or it might not.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the biblical thing there, and we were talking earlier about this and saying how a lot of fans of El Topo describe it as a very biblical Western, in the sense what the term they use is they say it's an Old Testament and New Testament film, because without giving anything away or going into any detail, there's a big shift in the middle of the movie, and although ostensibly it plays like a spaghetti Western for its entire length, the first half and the second half are actually very different, and they're almost about a very different character within the same body. So you've got this real sense, as you say, of you just don't know what's coming next, and I think that applies to pretty much all of his work.
So this film did have like a massive impact on, as we talked about, that kind of acid Western scene and beyond. Mainly, I guess, because it played midnight shows. One of the original midnight movies, wasn't it? It played midnight shows for 7 years after it was released.
This all happened in New York. It was a phenomenon in New York in the early 70s. There were two main theatres, one called the Elgin Theatre and one called the Waverley, and they used to put on these midnight shows as a new form of cinema exhibition. And because a lot of this cult cinema was emerging at the time and couldn't necessarily get conventional release and conventional distribution, the Elgin in particular, they try out these films over a week or perhaps over a weekend or something, and found that they were turning people away. There were, every sort of freak and misfit in New York was coming out.
That was quite a few.
Oh yeah. And El Topo in particular, John Lennon was seen there a couple of times. John and Yoko went to see that at the Elgin, and came out and loved it. And so you'd get celebrity names turning up, but you'd get every sort of Borman misfit in the area would be out there as well. And these films, they were playing for, hard to believe now, but some of them were playing for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. We're not talking about weeks or months here. They were sort of on every weekend. And of course, the film that people will be aware of as being part of this phenomenon came some years later with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was the sort of biggie, and that's like poster boy of the midnight movie. But yeah, El Topo was really the film that kicked that whole scene off.
Okay, so we're moving on. You mentioned John Lennon and Yoko, and that does have a point to play in Jodorowsky's next movie, The Holy Mountain.
Very much, yeah.
So John Lennon and Yoko liked it. I think the other Beatles were involved.
George Harrison.
That's it. Yeah, George Harrison.
Mr. Film in the Beatles. Yeah.
He and they pumped money into Jodorowsky to make another movie.
Yeah.
So they were involved in that. And equally were involved in suppressing the film afterwards.
Yes, that's right.
It's like John Lennon funded it and Alan Klein suppressed it afterwards, the Beatles manager.
Alan Klein was sort of involved with the Beatles then. He was sort of, the contractual situation's all very weird, and I'm sure Beatles experts know more about it than I do. But I think Lennon was signed to him. He was Lennon's manager, and he'd got some sort of deal with the Beatles as well. And Lennon and Yoko came out of El Topo and just sort of said to Alan Klein, look, this film's amazing. We want to see more from this guy. Give him what he needs, and Holy Mountain was the result 3 years later, and George Harrison had seen El Topo and was a big fan and was very supportive of Jodorowsky too. And Holy Mountain's a weird example of seeing a filmmaker who's used to working not just in film, but in all of the other sort of artistic endeavours that he did, with very little, with no money, no resources, just making the best of what he's got around him and using his friends and so on. And then suddenly he's given this blank cheque, and that could have easily gone overboard. It could have killed the film. It could have made it into a situation where he'd got pressure being put on him. Oh, you must do this, you must do that. It's my dollar, and that never happened. And he turned out to make a film that was even better than El Topo, in my view. And again, Rebecca, even less easy to understand, I think. But great to watch again in terms of it being a sort of sketchy set piece. What the hell's coming next sort of thing. But yeah, as you say, Adam, ABCO, Alan Klein's company, Rolling Stones fans will be aware of this because he kept their albums out of the marketplace for years and years and years. Took me ages to get copies of things like Aftermath and Between the Buttons. And he did the same with film. Unfortunately, he owned the rights for years to Jodorowsky's big three movies. So this is why audiences haven't seen them, because as a cinema programmer over the years, that they've sort of popped up very, very sporadically here and there.
Well, Holy Mountain was not available from pretty much from the 70s through to, I want to say, the early 2000s when it received a DVD release, I believe. But prior to that, it wasn't played. I don't think it was played. They were basically hyping it as a banned film, effectively. In all the same ways that you would when DVDs were pushing out films and they were saying banned for 30 years, banned for 30 years, banned for 40 years. They used the same style of marketing for Holy Mountain, which wasn't banned, but it was suppressed. I guess it was kept from the public.
Yeah, but here suppressed not by any sort of authority or any sort of moral group, but by the guy who funded it.
It just wasn't out. So, but yeah, it was interesting that it had that sort of like forbidden fruit kind of appeal for me when I first saw it. It was like it's not banned, but it's banned. Is it banned or is it when it's certainly out there, and it's an 18 certificate, so it's I think it's an 18 certificate,
yeah.
So it's pretty out there, So I was watching it in the same way as I was watching all those re-releases of those video nasties and some of those films that have been banned. So I had it in that same category, which kind of coloured my view of it as I was watching it, I must admit.
I was going to ask, did it sort of live up to the status that you'd built up in your mind?
No, well, I had to watch it a second time. Once I'd taken away all that, well, it's going to be a bit like Cannibal Holocaust, isn't it? Or it's going to be a bit like whatever horror movie that had been banned. And it's like, no, it's not that. So I had to rewatch it with a different viewpoint, and thoroughly enjoyed it again. Went along for the ride rather than really enjoying the story. What about you, Becky?
I was going to say I was the opposite. I purposely didn't research anything before watching the film, and I was taken back by the violence within the films.
I think that's a good way to approach a filmmaker like Jodorowsky, is to go in absolutely cold like that. So what was that like? Can you sort of describe watching the films and what was going through your mind as they sort of panned out? Because clearly you were going in as a complete blank slate. So how did the film sort of play for you?
Again, I think I was used to sort of going by scene, but it's just, I was just trying to figure out if there was sort of a political reason behind it. To a certain extent, I also as well started to analyse it again, which I don't think you should do. But I think it took me back for a while. But I watched that after watching El Topo, so I sort of knew what it was going to be about.
I always find like Jodorowsky is very much an emotional filmmaker, where it's less about what's happening and it's like more about what emotion you're getting from that scene. So hence the violence, hence the sex, hence the nudity, hence those various different elements. Yeah. They're done to evoke an emotion, evoke a reaction, rather than to tell a story, I guess, in any ways, which in that way is very similar to Lynch. I think Lynch works in a similar way, where he creates moodscapes, for the want of sounding too arty, but he creates those things where you are going along in the journey, and that adds to that feeling of a trip, I guess. Yeah.
I think Jodorowsky sees himself as being a sort of mixture of like Zen master, philosopher, shaman,
deity.
Indeed. He does actually, in across his films, you will hear the words "I am God" and "I am not God" at various times, which just goes to confuse the matter, I suppose. But he doesn't even know himself whether he's a god.
He just needs more confidence as a filmmaker.
Oh yeah, I think so. But
he needs to believe himself.
All of that sort of shamanism and all of that sort of weird philosophy, and of course, around the time he's making these films, you've even got this sort of mysticism feeding into mainstream TV with things like the Kung Fu TV series and stuff, which is almost like a television version of Alejandro Jodorowsky, you know. But yeah, this all actually feeds into his movies. I think what you're seeing on screen is a projection of his own character, and it's telling that in most of his movies either he's the main actor in them, or in some of the later ones he starts using family members in major roles. So it's all very, very, very personal, and it's all very, very this is the contents of the inside of my skull sort of thing.
Yeah, well, his son Brontis was the little boy in El Topo, wasn't it? It was Brontis, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's always had that family connection. But like you say, he's a filmmaker who started off like using what he had, and he had a baby. So let's use it.
Exactly, yeah.
I've got a horse, I've got a baby, let's make a Western.
Yeah. Brontis tells a great story on a Jodorowsky documentary, actually, where at the start of El Topo, there's that scene where the Jodorowsky, the cowboy character, and his naked son ride into the desert. And he tells his son, he says, "You were 7 years old, you know, you must bury your favourite toy and this picture of your mother." And he does that. And Brontis says that years later, I think about 25 years later, he was together with his dad, and he sort of said, you know, you've now reached the age where we need to dig up those things. And Jodorowsky had actually gone into Brontis's back garden, and he'd buried this really nice plush-looking teddy bear and a more recent colour photograph of his mother. And he didn't tell him what they were, and he sort of dug these things up and thought, oh, it's the stuff from El Topo, except it's not. It's like new, nice-looking versions of it. So, again, I think he was sort of scratching his head trying to say, what's the message my dad's giving me here? But yeah, he got something out of that. And I think that's a nice little story, and shows that Jodorowsky sort of does connect his life and his family with his art, and that things can filter from reality into his movies and then back again, you know. And I think if you asked his other kids, they've probably all got very similar stories of things that he's done for them that sort of filter into the family life and into the art and into whatever's up there in Jodorowsky's brain.
Yeah, he just wanted a gift token, didn't he? And he had to go and dig up his teddy bear. Very.
At least he got a new teddy bear out of it. You know, the old one was probably rotting out in a Mexican desert somewhere. You know,
yeah, I'm sure the 50-year-old Brontis was happy with the teddy bear. Yeah, cool. Okay, let's move on to Jodorowsky's later stuff, because after that point, he started to find it really difficult to get things done, get things made. What I'd like to talk about is his adaptation of Dune, which is now being made by Denis Villeneuve. It's coming out at Christmas, and early footage is just being released on the internet now, apparently. I read this morning. But Jodorowsky was the one who had a first crack at Frank Herbert's Dune. A documentary was made about this 5-10 years ago, something like that.
Just called Jodorowsky's Dune.
Jodorowsky's Dune, and it is absolutely astonishing the amount of work that went into that project for it not to get made.
Yeah. One of the big occasions where that's happened. Obviously, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of sort of unfilmed projects, you know, if not thousands, but this is perhaps the best known one in movie history, or one of the top 2 or 3. Yeah, he just poured his heart and soul into it. You know, they did loads and loads of sort of pre-production drawings and loads and loads of preparation, and then ultimately it just never happened. The rights then got sold to Dino De Laurentiis, who himself then went through a process of years and years before we ended up with the David Lynch version. So Jodorowsky, of course, then again he never wasted anything, and he kept a lot of those ideas from the preparations on Dune and filtered that into moving into the world of comics.
Yeah,
and teamed up with the great artist Mobius.
Well, that's where he first worked with Mobius, wasn't it? On that production,
on Dune. Yeah. So again, Mobius again had sort of, if you want to put it this way, wasted years of his life working on Dune, and again, luckily they were able to sort of salvage a lot of that work rebrand it as something else, and under various titles, they've sort of used a lot of that work, or a lot of the sort of ideas that they had, and notions that they had, and designs that they had, and filtered those into their comic books. But
that movie in itself has, I mean, you talk about influences, we've talked about influences of Jodorowsky's had on cinema. That failed production had massive influences on cinema generally. I mean, mainly because of the Alien connection with the crew that was working on that. Basically moved off from that onto Alien. So Geiger was involved. Sure. Dan O'Bannon was involved on Dune. Sadly, they didn't bring over Salvador Dali as the Emperor of the Universe onto Dune, onto Alien, which would have been amazing. But yeah, so the impact Jodorowsky is having, even when films haven't been made of his, is impactful on cinema in general.
Yeah, I think all we've got of Dune is the sort of designs and the sketches and so on, and the script and what have you. But yeah, to get an idea of what this might have looked like as a movie, yeah, there are indicators out there, such as Alien. You know, you can get a flavour of what we might have seen and what it might have been like. As you say, Salvador Dali was going to be involved. Orson Welles was cast as well. So the ambition of the project was just wilder than anything you'd seen. And then, of course, what happens is a much smaller movie production, much cheaper sort of movie production comes along, a little thing called Star Wars a couple of years later. And that changes the game, you know. But I'm just thinking about this in relation to having mentioned Star Wars there. Jodorowsky said about, while he was working on Dune, he was quoted as saying that he didn't like the hardware in science fiction films, this whole sort of, it looks like a fridge in space sort of thing, you know. And if you look at the designs from Dune, you know, they're much more organic in a way, again, that's been imitated by more recent filmmakers. You know, this idea of, it's got to look like a sort of a sort of phallic shaped rocket, or it's got to look like a sort of wheel in space, or it's got to be white with a few smudges on it to make it look like it's been used. No. Mine's going to look like a cat, or, you know, a lion, or some weird spotted creature, you know, with all of these strange fins and things on it, and it's just going to sort of float through the galaxy, and it's going to sort of move around and not have any sort of shape or form or anything. This is the sort of thinking we've got, unsurprisingly, from Jodorowsky, you know, sort of trying to reinvent what hard science fiction is by softening it and making it a lot more sort of organic and a lot more fluid.
Yeah, you saw that. Obviously, you saw the results in Alien. Obviously, the very organic designs of Geiger very much came to the fore there. I guess that's a fascinating period in cinema, where before pre-Star Wars, when studios were funding science fiction films, I guess they were looking at 2001. I guess Dark Star?
Yeah. Well, again, we talked about the acid western, and you've got acid science fiction going on post-2001. Silent Running, Dark Star, Jodorowsky's Dune would have fitted right into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to his, I want to say comics work, but not so much about comics, but basically he's created his own religion, hasn't he?
Yeah.
It's pretty much and that does not come as does that come as a surprise, Becky, after watching El Topo and Holy Mountain, that he's developed his own I don't want to say religion, but like method of living life.
A philosophy
on life.
Yeah, I think so, because I was trying to think like back to if I was watching this, you know, when it was released, and it's the counterculture. You would have been fed up of playing by the rules and the establishment. So it's kind of like it would be really rebellious, and it's just anything goes philosophy. So yeah, I'm not surprised at all.
No, I mean, it was often said that if you've not seen Jodorowsky in the 80s and his films, you just nip to Paris, he'll be on the streets giving tarot readings. So he moves to Paris in the late 70s, and then just end up working in comics extensively from like late 70s through to now, basically.
Yeah. That's the weird thing about his career, is that, as I say, he's more of a sort of Renaissance man than he is a filmmaker. He's only made 8 feature films. He's been working in film. He first picked up a camera in 1953, so you're going back nearly 70 years, and in that time, in well over 60 years, he's made 8 feature films, he's made 1 short, and he's made a recent documentary. And even then, you sort of divide that up and you say, well, that's 1 film every 8 years. No, it doesn't work like that. He makes his films in batches. He sort of made 3 in the late 60s, early 70s, then a long gap to 1980, then another long gap to the end of the 80s where he made 2 films together, and then a 25-year gap before he made his 2 recent biographical films. But in between, as you say, it's been other obsessions, painting, sculpture, and then the big one being his immersion into the world of comics, which to a certain group of his fans is what they know him for.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, if you don't watch films, then the guy's a comic book writer. So, fascinating career. I want to say career diversion, but it's not. I guess the films are the career diversion.
It's a life.
It's a life, yeah, of course, absolutely, yeah. And we were talking about this earlier, but that sort of like creative, those filmmakers like from the 70s, and you were talking about this, Darrell, about how like they're not filmmakers, even though we talk about them as filmmakers. They're not filmmakers. They are multimedia artists. They are just creatives, I guess, in the broadest sense of the term.
Yeah, I was trying to put a little list together of people who are sort of representative of that, and it's not even just within a sort of short period of time that this happened, because the names that I came up with span decades, almost a century. Jean Cocteau was like that. He was a filmmaker. Well, he made films, but he was so much more than a filmmaker, as we know. I suppose you can put someone like Orson Welles into that, who sort of came into movies from radio and from theatre, and then went off and did all kinds of other things, became director, producer, actor. But again, like Jodorowsky, struggled to raise money for personal projects, and so would often have long periods where he didn't make films and would go off and do other things. More recently, in the past 30 years or so, we've had people like Clive Barker and the aforementioned David Lynch, who've been sort of sculptors, tactile artists, painters, in Barker's case, a playwright, and then sporadically done movies when they've had something to say via that particular medium. And of course, with Lynch, we've recently seen him make his 18-hour spectacular with the new Twin Peaks. That set me thinking, what if Jodorowsky got offered, what if Netflix came to Jodorowsky and said, do you want to make a 10-part TV show for us?
Let's hope for Son of El Topo yet.
I can't imagine what we'd get, but yeah, Son of El Topo is another, like Dune, that's perhaps his second most famous unfilmed project. He wanted to do Son of El Topo, very, very early on. He's been talking about that since the 70s. The nearest that came to fruition was an incarnation of it that was going to include one of Jodorowsky's sons. I think he was going to use Brontis again, alongside Marilyn Manson and Johnny Depp. So whether it's unfortunate or fortunate that we never saw that version, I don't know. But he's now 90 and he's still talking about making this film. I wonder if it's just something that he says to interviewers, a bit like I suspect David Lynch's One Saliva Bubble and Ronnie Rocket were sort of projects that he'd got a ready answer whenever an interviewer sort of said, "What's your next project?" I wonder if Jodorowsky's Son of El Topo is a real thing, or if it's just something to dismiss awkward interview questions. But yeah, there was apparently serious talk of Johnny Depp and Marilyn Manson getting involved, and Jodorowsky has always kept up with current trends, and apparently Manson was invited on board because Jodorowsky's a fan. So,
well, I can see. I mean, both of those, like mid-90s. I mean, Johnny Depp had just done Dead Man, right?
Yes,
In the mid-90s.
yeah.
One of the great acid westerns, I guess.
Yeah, sure. That's perhaps the last great one. Yeah.
So maybe that would have fed into Jodorowsky's thinking with the sequel of...
And he's working with Terry Gilliam as well. He's doing the Hunter S. Thompson thing and so on. So you can see how an actor like Johnny Depp is someone who he can do the commercial stuff. He's got feet in both camps. He can do commercial, but he's very much in the world of somebody like Jodorowsky and very much on Jodorowsky's radar, I'm sure.
Particularly at that time as well in the 90s. Yeah. Cool. Okay. I think unless there's anything else you'd like to bring to the table of Jodorowsky, I think that is interesting about the multidiscipline art forms, because that's one thing I would say. I think that's missing from filmmaking in general.
Yeah.
There's so many filmmakers whose only influence are other films.
Yeah.
And they come through and they're making films. And I blame Tarantino for this completely. But it is that, I don't blame Tarantino, but it is that mentality of like where they are making films because they watched films and they watch more films and they know lots of films.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the really great filmmakers come through and they're influenced by music, they're influenced by dance, they're influenced by art. They bring other art forms into their filmmaking and make them live and breathe.
Yeah. Well, we did a course here a few years ago called the Video Store Generation, and Tarantino again is sort of the poster boy for that. But the filmmakers who call themselves the Video Store Generation aren't sort of Tarantino based. They're the more serious side of commercial American filmmaking at the moment. Alexander Payne, Wes Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson, George Clooney and people like that. And you're right, a lot of their work is based on the fact that they grew up watching movies. They grew up in the 80s and they went to the video store every weekend. And I think as these filmmakers sort of progress, you are starting to see other influences creeping in. But primarily it comes from mum and dad taking us to the pictures, renting 3 videos at a weekend, whatever. And we need things to open up. I think we need more filmmakers. Well, this is perhaps an impossible thing to say, but we need more filmmakers like David Lynch and Alejandro Jodorowsky. But on the other hand, of course, we
need more one-offs like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it ain't going to happen. Yeah. So you can't demand more filmmakers like this because they're sort of once in a generation. So
yeah, and it's refreshing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that bombshell. Yes, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next month.